So I've got the recording going. Okay, so.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my name is Hannah, and this is Debora, and Debora might have talked to you a little bit about our class project, but it's just to kind of get a little understanding of what your research is and your teaching experience, just in general, as well as like with COVID. And so yeah, so we have about 13 questions, so we'll just jump right into it, I guess.
Sure.
Okay, so the first question is, when did you decide to pursue a career in your academic field?
Well, I can tell you that there was no sort of one defining moment where I said, this is where I want to go, this is what I want to do. So the area where I grew up, I grew up on Cape Breton Island, so on the east coast of Canada. And it's not a very wealthy area. It's an area where people are constantly losing their jobs. Unemployment is quite high. I was the first person in my family to go to university. We immigrated to Canada in 1924, and when I started university in 1988, I was the first person who was able to go to university. So my objective was a job, because growing up in that sort of unpredictable environment, that was my goal. And I was told that university would give me job security. And so I just kind of decided biology, because I liked biology in high school. And so during my undergrad degree, was my major in biology, and I had a minor in English. Didn't know what I wanted to do, so I thought maybe I would be a teacher, so I was leaving my options open. And then a faculty member at the university suggested I go on to graduate school to pursue a master's, and that's where I had to make a decision, and I decided I liked infectious disease research, and so that's kind of where that started. So I went to the University of Guelph for my master's as well as my doctorate, and I worked on animal diseases. And from there, I went to McGill, where I switched to human diseases, and that's kind of where I'm at right now. So infectious diseases like COVID are right up my alley. So while this is difficult for a lot of people, I'm kind of like enjoying living through a pandemic, because you don't get that experience very often, that sort of lived experience in my field. So I just read about these things. So that's kind of my journey into the academic field.
Perfect. Yeah, that's definitely cool that you get to like actually experience like a pandemic and actually kind of do a little bit of research on it, which is kind of cool. What initially was there anything that like attracted you to your field other than the fact that you liked it in high school? Was there anything like?
Well, while I'm in infectious disease, my original goal was actually to do some research on great white sharks. But very early on in my education, I realized that nobody was going to pay me to go and look at great white sharks. There was just no future in that. So yeah, I think it was probably just the idea that, if you're in the healthcare sector, you're going to be employed. But I also found a lot of the infections that I was working on at that time were really interesting. So most of what I work on is found in Africa, not in Canada. We're very fortunate that we don't have these infections here. But a lot of these infections that I work on have had a huge impact on the history of the world. So it was kind of, it was kind of neat. But there was, that's kind of how I got attracted to this field.
Okay. Was there anyone who like influenced you into this field? Like, was there any particular people that?
Yeah, so as I said, no one in my family had gone to university. So not that they were discouraging, but they were, well, we can't help you because none of us went to university. So good luck. And, they were supportive in the sense that my mother always made sure I had a meal on the table, and, people sort of looked out for me. But it was in university, in my undergraduate degree, there were two individuals, Cheryl Bartlett and David McCorkadale. So I was actually I think I was in my final year of university, and I still didn't know sort of what I wanted to do in terms of employment. And it kind of seemed like, I don't know if my university skills had really set me up for a job, which is really what I wanted. But, universities, I think, set you up more for a career, for long-term employment strategies. So these two individuals were newly hired at the university, and they kind of, gave me some opportunities. They sent me to a conference to meet other people, to make a presentation. And so when I went to that conference, it was at another university. I made connections and I met some really great people. And that was kind of my jumping off point, those two individuals. In fact, they supported me all through my career.
That's good. Yeah, it's definitely good to have people who support you throughout. Obviously, it makes it a bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say was like the most enjoyable, like exciting aspects of your career, of your study of field, I guess?
I would say, because I work on infectious diseases, and really what I'm trying to work on are ways to control or ultimately cure it. I think it's when I make a discovery that can actually have an impact on these diseases and really change the way that that they're treated, that they could actually be controlled. So there have been a few of those moments over the years.
That's good. What is the most significant challenge that your students meet within your courses?
I would say I'll start with probably first year students, because that's where I feel most of the challenges lie. By the time you get to my third and fourth year courses, we've sort of, I always say we beat you up enough that you know what you're doing. And so you've kind of got that sort of that strength, that backbone. But what I find with first year courses, so all my courses are in the Department of Biology. And so students are expected to have a course, a high school course, or its equivalent, Biology 40S. That's the prerequisite for that course. So what I found was that students had the 40S, or the equivalent, which is the Manitoba equivalent of grade 12 biology, but it wasn't taught the same, not across the country, not even within Manitoba. So I had students who, there's what we call a curriculum document that says for each grade of your education, this is what you're supposed to learn for every subject. So for Biology 40S, there's a list of here's all the things you're supposed to have been taught. And that's not happened. Locally within Brandon, those high schools, yes, some of them do. But as we move further afield, particularly in rural northern communities or in Indigenous communities, they're not meeting those requirements. And so while they'll get credit for the course and have done very well, it actually isn't what they were supposed to learn, the content. So when I teach the course, it's like, well, the prerequisite is Biology 40S. So they should have learned all of these things, and they didn't. So I have a spectrum. I have students who have never been taught any of this, despite having the credit. Students who are bored silly because they've learned this. And so I kind of teach sort of to the middle, I suppose, have some stuff for, to maybe further enrich those who know what they're doing, but then you also have those who struggle, and what can you do to help those that struggle? So that's, I would say, the challenge in first year. Plus, the way we teach the course, there's multiple instructors, so students will, complain, well, I can't get used to their style of testing or their lecturing, but you know what? You're going to have a whole bunch of different teachers throughout your career. So, we're actually, the way we teach the course is to advantage the students, not to disadvantage them. So that's a big challenge I find. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I've definitely heard the first year student, because my friend is from Saskatchewan, and she always talks about things, especially in English class too, that like I've never learned, and she's like, oh, that was like first knowledge to me. Like yeah, so like I definitely get that.
And I had the same experience when I went to university in first year. It was the same thing. Like I didn't learn a lot of the things they were talking about. And so, yeah, first year was a struggle for me in university as well.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about your research, or like more of like your research interests?
So I have three, I would say, major research projects on the go right now. Just because diversifying your sort of portfolio of research is good. It opens up more funding opportunities. So my main research is around control of infectious disease, and I work on two diseases. And so I look at sort of developing vaccines, but vaccines are very, very hard to develop effective vaccines. So the fact that we have three for COVID is a miracle, like incredible. People need to really appreciate that and not be scared of them either. So that's really hard for a number of diseases, particularly the ones that I work on. So we're reliant on drugs to treat. And when you only have drugs as a source of treatment, you end up with drug resistance. So my research with infectious diseases is around combating drug resistance. I also have another project looking at the effect of microplastics on the immune system. So people recycle their plastic. They think, oh, it gets recycled, it gets broken down, but you actually can't get rid of plastic. You might not be able to see it with your eye, but under a microscope, there's still pieces of that plastic there, and it's called a microplastic. So these microplastics are in our water, they're in the soil, and what we see is that they're accumulating in at least in animals. They're building up in their system. So I'm looking at, we now have evidence that this happens in humans as well, and what effect is that having on the immune system? And so the reason that I focus on the immune system is because if your immune system can't get rid of something, what it does, it builds this wall around whatever it is, with this idea that, well, I can't get rid of you, but I'm going to make sure you don't go anywhere else and cause some trouble. And that's what we call inflammation. So what we see is that these microplastics are staying within the intestines. And we have a theory that this could be a cause of things like inflammatory bowel disease, such as Crohn's disease, ileitis, because you only see those infections, those diseases in Western countries, industrialized nations. You don't see them in developing countries. And so the difference is, the pollution, the plastic. So that's a second project that I'm working on. And so we have some really good results there too. And then the third is just for fun. I've gone back to my great white sharks. And so I'm actually now doing some research on great white sharks and looking at where they mate in Atlantic Canada, because we have a population of great white sharks as well. So I have some colleagues at the University of Guelph. So that's kind of my fun stuff for me.
That's good. I think Deborah's got some questions now.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Please tell us what drew you to conduct this research?
Well, the great white sharks, that was kind of a childhood dream. When I was 5 years old and I was in what we called primary, grade primary, it's sort of like kindergarten, but it was a whole day, much harder, the whole thing. But we had to do a reading test. And so I remember sitting with my teacher, Mrs. Windsor. It was late May, it was hot, it was sunny, and I had to do this reading test. And the book she got me to read was about this scientist, Dr. Eugenie Clark. And she's became known as the Shark Lady because she did research on sharks. And so she got me to read this book about sharks. And I just never, ever forgot that book, or Dr. Clark. I actually got to meet her at one point when I was much older. And so that kind of started me off on my research with respect to great white sharks. The plastics, yeah, I have an interest in the immune system. And so the fact that we see in industrialized nations, there's an increase, a rise in the number of allergies, autoimmune type disorders that you do not see in developing nations. And so it's something that we're doing with respect to our industrialization that's causing these increases in allergies. And if you have an allergy, you can be like me and it's just really annoying, itchy, watery eyes for most of the year, or you can have very severe allergies. And so that was something that was of interest to me. You know, I never had allergies when I lived in Ontario, but when I moved to Manitoba, I got allergies. My spouse had severe allergies in Ontario. We moved here, his are gone. It's like, what is going on? So I'm just very curious about that as to why that's happening. And that's where the microplastics kind of come in, that these could be leading to these types of disorders. And then the infectious diseases, I think that stemmed from undergraduate university, where those two faculty members that I talked about, Dr. Bartlett and Dr. McCorkadale, that was their field, and they talked about it with such passion that it was hard not to get interested in what they were doing. So, yeah.
Thank you for that answer. And why is this research important to you, or maybe to the society?
Well, it's important for me, I guess, for all the reasons I've already stated. But in terms of society, well, great white sharks are apex predators. So they're at the top of the food chain, as are all sharks. And if sharks were to disappear, it would have profound impacts on ecosystems. In fact, you would end up with economic collapse, ecosystem collapse, oceans would cease to function, coral reefs would disappear. There's all sorts of impacts that would happen if sharks disappear. And so the reason I'm interested in their mating behavior, their mating grounds, is so that, excuse me, we can protect those grounds so that these animals are able to breed. Now, I could work on any shark, but I mean, if you're going to work on sharks, you might as well work on a great white shark, right? A lot more interest than say a dog shark, which are tiny little things that, you know, not all that interesting. The plastics, well, we have got to figure out a way to deal with the way we are polluting our environment. And so, and the impact that this pollution is having on us as human beings, on animals, the animals we eat, even on our plants. And so that's where the microplastic research comes in. And then again, infectious diseases. Well, the diseases that I work on, they affect more than 80%, excuse me, of the world's population, yet there's only 10% of the global sort of health funding goes to looking at these diseases and trying to cure them. So if we could treat 80% of the world's population, what would that do to the economy, to our overall health and well-being? It would be huge. And so that's really one of the reasons that I'm very interested in that research. Yeah.
Perfect. So how have you managed your research? Like, how do you plan, organize, or prioritize your work?
Well, a lot of it will depend on money. So I need to get grants. And so this is money that I sort of write up. Here's my idea, how I'm going to tackle the problem. And there's different agencies that you can apply to for this funding. So all of my funding is external to the university. The university doesn't give us any money to do this work. So I get it from the federal government, Public Health Agency of Canada, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, World Health Organization. So there's all that money that's available. So depending on the amount of funds that I get, that will influence the type of project that I'm going to work on. The type of work that I do, it requires a laboratory, equipment, people. I could not do all this work myself. So I'm reliant on students as well to help me. And so again, I need the funding to pay the students because in science, in the discipline of science, you get paid to go to school, to get your education, to work on your research. And so that's a factor as well. And then I just kind of, plan, what's my objective? What's my question? And then I kind of line things up from that point forward. I always plan a lot more than is possible, just because that sort of gives you some flexibility. So if this isn't working out, this particular line of research, or you're hit with a pandemic and you can't do this, well, we can move over and look at this other way of completing the project. So there's always a mixture of a lot of sort of smaller projects within that much larger project.
Right. So what would you say are challenges affecting or challenges that you faced in conducting this research today?
Because of COVID or just in general?
Just in general.
Challenges, I would say probably my current job makes it challenging, just because as the Dean of Science, I'm really busy. And so just sort of trying to remind myself to go and talk to my students. So I set up weekly meetings with all my students just so we can stay in touch with one another. Funding is always a challenge because it seems like all I do is write grants, try to get more money, because there's never enough. There really is never enough. And so that's always a challenge as well. I always say, if I had all the money in the world, I could solve all these problems, but I don't. So, it's about challenging in terms of trying to find what I call bang for the buck. I want to have impact. So with the amount of money I have, where can I direct that research to have the most impact? So I personally believe that what we do should benefit society, because in a strange way, or in all cases, the money we get is coming from taxpayers. However it funnels down, it's coming from taxpayers. And so I'm a taxpayer, and I like to see that my money is going to something useful and something that has impact.
Thank you. And how has COVID affected your research?
I would say probably, well, we've been pretty lucky in Manitoba as well as at Brandon University, in that we were only kind of shut down until maybe the beginning of May. So most people had things they could do from home, and then we were allowed to come into the buildings to continue to conduct our research and continue into the field. I would say overall, in terms of my concerns around COVID, I have three major concerns. First, we put so much money into COVID, and I get it, like all kinds of money got directed that way. I wonder what projects got derailed, or what important information will we not get because so many people started to focus on COVID. So did their regular sort of important research, did that stop? The government put so much money into COVID, we're going to have to pay it back at some point, so what's that going to look like? Will it be a reduction in the number of grants? Are our taxes going to go up? I have concerns about that because, money doesn't grow on trees. And so it has to come from somewhere. Well, it's made from trees. That's my son over there. It's a PD day, but it doesn't really grow on it though. And then my third concern, within science, we've recognized that equity-seeking groups, so women, racialized minorities, Indigenous people, members of the LGBTQ plus two-spirited community, these individuals have been disadvantaged. They've been marginalized and disadvantaged. And what we see because of COVID, particularly with women, they are once again disadvantaged because when COVID hit, if you had children, most likely it was the woman who stayed home, gave up whatever to look after the children. So from March until June last year, my son was at home and I was driving back and forth, teaching grade 2, trying to do my job, trying to get people through the pandemic. So I see that while we made some steps with respect to these equity seeking groups, I have really big, real concerns that any progress is going to get derailed perhaps, or will be set back once again because of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, COVID has been really an issue, and we hope it will go away soon.
Yes.
So another question is how, like, do you have plans for conducting another research in future?
Well, yes, and that will depend on what the sort of outcome of my 2 grants are. So I have a really large grant from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure how I want this grant to end. Do I want positive results or negative results? So we have funding. I have a colleague, a partner, we're screening ticks and mosquitoes for new viruses. Because of climate change, we see that a lot of animals, insects are moving north into Canada, and they're moving from areas in the southern US where there are certain infections that are quite serious. And for example, there's a number of viruses that are carried by these insects. And so we know that the insects are now in Manitoba. We don't know if they have brought these infections with them. And so part of me is, well, if they did bring them, that's lots more money for me because the research is going to continue. But if they do have these infections, I will be longing for the days of COVID because these other infections are quite serious. They're all viral infections that cause something known as encephalitis. That's a swelling of your brain. So you don't want that. So we're kind of, I don't know. So that's one of the things I'm looking at right now. And then depending on the work with the microplastics, it looks like it is causing issues around what we call inflammation. And so what I would like to do, the next question is, do people with Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, do they have microplastics? And if we remove the microplastics, will that stop the condition? So that's probably my next 2 projects.
Okay. Thank you. And if you could give a student advice about pursuing this field of study, what might that be? And what courses will you recommend to that student to help prepare them for a career in this field of study?
Okay, so I would say I would start with if you're at Brandon University and you wanted to pursue this field of study, here you have to have a major and a minor. So I would say major in biology, minor in chemistry, because you need to be strong in both of those areas. I would also recommend taking some other, elective courses in sociology, what else? Anthropology would be, there's some good courses there as well. And then in terms of pursuing a field, this field of study, I would say get involved in some research projects. So both biology, chemistry, in fact, every department in science have research topics courses. So rather than go sit in a classroom, listen to a lecture, you can actually do an independent study. And so I would say get involved with an independent study. You can do, there's a 300 level course, there's a 400 level course. You can do the honors thesis. There are faculty who hire students in the summers to be their research assistants. So that is definitely the way you should go if this is the field that you want to get into. And I recommend it because you might think that maybe it looks really cool when someone else is doing it or whatever you guys use these days, interesting. But maybe when you actually start to do it, it's like, oh, you know what, that's not for me. So I try to encourage students to figure out if what it is you think you want to do is really what you want to do as early as possible in your career. So if that means volunteering, just so that you don't, you know, I've met people who went through all this trouble to get into medical school. And then, yeah, I don't like that. I don't like being a nurse. I don't like being a pharmacist. I don't want to be a teacher. Well, you know, you should have figured that. It's best to figure it out early so you're not, you know, losing time. Yeah. And if you're not sure at all about what you want to do a 4-year degree, because at least that can open up a lot of doors for you, give you options, where a 3-year degree, you're very limited in where you can go with that degree. But be prepared for probably doing something beyond the degree. It could be a diploma, it could be another degree, if you're looking for a career, some security in your career. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, we have come to the end of the interview.
Okay.
Those were the questions we had for you. Thank you so much for providing answers to our questions and for your time. Thank you.
Yeah, well, good luck. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can just send me an email.
Okay, thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.